I have been the oldest man in Cedar Crossing for 19 years now, and the trouble with being the oldest man in a town is that folks expect you to know how everything turned out. They sit me down on the porch of the new hotel, the one with the painted sign and the glass windows, and they ask me what the place was like before, and I tell them the truth, which is that it was a poorer, harder, hungrier town than they would believe, and that it was very nearly lost altogether, and that it was saved by a plate of stew. They laugh when I say that. They think I am working up to a joke, the way old men do, but I am not. I tended the stoves at the Mercer house when I was a boy of 15 with more elbows than sense, and I saw the plate of stew given, and I saw what came back from it, and if you will give me the time I will tell it the way it happened, which is the only way worth telling. In those days the Carita ran high in spring and low in August, and the only safe ford for 40 miles was the gravel shelf below our town, so everyone bound west came through Cedar Crossing whether they meant to or not. That should have made us rich. It did not. It made us a place where a man named Royal Tate could set up a gaming hall called the Gilded Spur and skim the cream off every drover, freighter, and homesteader who stopped to rest his stock before the crossing. Tate was a smooth, soft-handed man who wore a gray coat and never raised his voice, and I want you to understand that he was the worst kind of crooked, which is the patient kind. He did not rob anyone. He let them rob themselves. He ran a little game at the end of his bar that he called odds and evens, the simplest thing in the world. A man laid down his coin and called it odd or even, and Tate turned up 2 cards or rolled 2 dice, and you added them and you won or you lost. A child could understand it. That was the beauty of it, Tate would say, spreading his soft hands. No skill, no cheating, just the Lord's own chance. Even a fool can't be swindled at odds and evens. And the town believed him, because it looked like the one honest thing in a dishonest house. Working men who would never sit down at faro would lay a week's wages on odds and evens, because there was nothing to it, because it was fair, because a man could win. And they did win, now and then, just often enough. And then they lost it back and a little more, slow and steady, year on year, until half the deeds in Cedar Crossing had Royal Tate's name penciled in the margin, and the town never quite understood how it had happened. I understood later, so did Della, but I am getting ahead of myself. Della Mercer ran the boarding house and the eating room across the street from the Spur, and she ran it alone after her husband died, which was a thing folks talked about behind their hands. Tom Mercer had been a kind man and a weak one, and the weakness had been the odds and evens game. He had sat at the end of Tate's bar night after night, certain he could feel the run of it, certain the next call would set them square, and when the lung fever took him one cold March he left Della a clean kitchen, a good name, and a paper for $1,100 owed to Royal Tate. He left her, in other words, a debt she had not made and a husband she had loved anyway. She was not a soft woman, Della, though she had a soft way. She was tall and quick and brown-haired, going early to gray at the temples, and she had a manner of looking straight at a man and waiting that made most men tell her the truth. She fed the town. That is the plainest way I can put it. The Mercer house set the best table between the river and the mountains, and Della kept the prices fair, and when a family came through busted and hungry, she fed them anyway and wrote it in a book she never once collected on. Tom's debt sat on her like a millstone, but she would not cheat a soul to lift it, and she would not let a child go from her door empty, and those 2 facts together are the whole shape of the woman. I worked her stoves and hauled her water and slept in the lean-to off the kitchen, and I would have walked into the river for her, the way a boy will for the first grown woman who treats him like he is worth something. Now, the night I am bound to tell about came in late November, with the first hard cold of the year sitting down over the Carita like a lid, and the wind coming off the water carrying ice in it. I had banked the kitchen fire and was wiping down the long table when the door let in a gust and a man. He was about the sorriest-looking traveler I had seen come through, and we saw plenty. He stood a head taller than most, lean to the point of gaunt, with a week of dark beard and a coat that had been good once and was not good now. His boots had walked a long way. He had no horse. I could tell that by the way he stood, like a man whose legs had carried him every mile, and he had the gray, scraped-out look of a fellow who has not eaten in longer than is wise. He stood just inside the door, holding his hat, and he looked at the empty tables and the cold lamps, and he said, in a low, even voice, "I see you're closed. I'm sorry to trouble you." And he turned to go back out into that wind. Della had come out of the back at the sound of the door. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, straight on and a beat too long, and I watched her see all of it, the boots, the coat, the cheekbones standing out hard under the beard. She did not see a saddle tramp. I want to be plain about that because the rest of the town did. She saw a hungry man. "Sit down," she said. He turned back. "Ma'am, I won't lie to you. I can't pay tonight. I came in to get out of the wind a minute and ask about work, and I see there's none. I'll go on." "You'll sit down," she said again, and there was no give in it. "Eli, the stew's still warm on the back of the stove. Bring it. And the bread." I want you to know what that stew was. It was the last of the pot, the part that gets thick and good at the bottom, the part Della meant to make her own supper out of, because times were lean for her too, and she did not waste. She gave it to that stranger and made herself a heel of bread and a cup of tea and sat across from him while he ate, not watching him close like you'd watch a dog you didn't trust, but easy, talking a little so he wouldn't feel watched at all. He ate like a man who knew how to make a meal last when he didn't know where the next one was. Slow, careful. He thanked her for every part of it. And when it was done, he sat with his hands around the warm cup and he said, "I'll work it off. Whatever you've got. Wood, water, mucking the stable. I don't take charity if I can help it." "It wasn't charity," Della said. "It was supper. There's a difference, and I'll thank you to remember it. What's your name?" "Gideon," he said. "Gideon Rourke." "Well, Mr. Rourke," she said, "I've a stable wants mucking and a woodpile wants splitting, and Eli here can't do it all himself though he thinks he can. There's a cot in the loft over the stable, dry and warm enough. You can stay a few days and earn your road money. After that, it's your business where you go." I saw something go across his face then that I did not understand at 15 and understand very well now. It was the look of a man who has been waiting a long time for someone to be plain and decent with him and has stopped expecting it. He covered it quick, but I saw it. "I'm obliged," was all he said. That was the plate of stew. That was the whole of it. A tired woman gave a hungry man the last of the pot and a dry place to sleep, and asked nothing. And the wheel that turned out of that small thing turned and turned until it had ground Royal Tate to powder and built half of what you see around you now. But on that night, it was only a man named Rourke, asleep in our hayloft, and the wind coming off the river with ice in it. He stayed 3 days, and then he stayed more. He was the best worker I ever saw, and I have seen a few. He did not talk much, but he did not loaf, and he had a way of finding the thing that needed doing before you thought to ask. He shored up the stable wall that had leaned for 2 years. He fixed the kitchen door that scraped. He split a winter's worth of wood and stacked it square as a wall. And he watched. That was the thing about Gideon Rourke I noticed before anyone. He watched everything. Quiet. The way a man watches who has learned the hard way that the world will get the jump on you if you let it. The town, as I said, wrote him off. A drifter with no horse and a wore-out coat is a saddle tramp to most folks, and they made up their minds, and that was that. The men at the spur called him Della's stray and laughed. Royal Tate, when he saw Rourke crossing the street, looked at him the way you'd look at a stray dog on your porch, not afraid. Just deciding whether it was worth the trouble of running off. He decided it wasn't. That was the first mistake Royal Tate made. And he made it because Gideon Rourke had spent years teaching men to make exactly that mistake. I did not know any of that yet. What I knew was that the stranger was kind to me. He showed me how to set an axe so it wouldn't glance, how to read weather off the river, how to gentle a spooked horse with my voice instead of my hands. He never once made me feel like the boy I was. And in the evenings, when the work was done, He would sit by the kitchen stove and talk low with Della while she mended or kept her books, and I would pretend to be busy so I could stay in the room. It was on one of those evenings that I first saw him near a deck of cards, and I have never forgotten it. A freighter named Coombs had stopped over, and he'd been losing at the Spur 3 nights running, and he came into the eating room sour and broke, complaining that the odds and evens game had to be crooked because no honest run of luck went that bad that long. The other men told him he was a poor loser. Coombs got loud, and Gideon Rourke, who had been mending a bridle by the stove, said, without looking up, "It's not luck, and it's not crooked the way you mean." The room went quiet. Coombs said, "What would a tramp know about it?" Rourke set down the bridle. There was an old deck of cards on the shelf that I used for solitaire, and he reached over and took it, and he began to handle it while he talked, easy, the way you'd thumb the pages of a book you'd read 100 times. "Odds and evens looks fair because it can't be marked the way a faro layout can," he said. "There's nothing to cheat. 2 cards turned, you add them, odd or even, so a man trusts it." The cards moved through his hands, cut and shuffled and squared, faster than I could follow, soft as falling snow. But a deck has 52 cards, and 26 are odd-numbered when you count the face cards a certain way, and 26 are even. Fair, you'd say. 50-50. "It is 50-50, Coombs said. "It is," Rourke agreed, "if the man turning the cards lets it be." He fanned the deck face up on the table in one long ribbon. "But the man who owns the house owns the deck, and he decides which cards are in it and which ones rest in his sleeve, and he can shade the odds a hair without anyone ever catching a marked card, because there is no marked card. There's just a few too many of one kind and a few too few of another, and over 1,000 turns that hair becomes a fortune. You can't catch it in one night. You can't catch it in 20. You only catch it if you count every card that comes up across a long time and find that the deck he's playing isn't the deck he showed you." He squared the cards and set them down and picked the bridle back up. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Coombs laughed ugly, listened to the tramp, spinning yarns for his supper. But 2 or 3 of the other men did not laugh, and I saw them looking at the deck on the table like it had teeth. I looked at Della. She was sitting very still over her account book, and she was not looking at the cards. She was looking at Gideon Rourke, and there was a question in her face that had not been there before. She waited until the room cleared, and I had been sent to bank the stove, which I did slow, with my ears wide open. "You handle a deck," she said, "like a man who's done more with it than mend bridles." He was quiet a while. The stove ticked. Finally he said, "I'll tell you because you've been square with me and because I'd rather you heard it from me than guessed at it. There was a time I made my living at the kind of table I just described. Not running it, sitting on the wrong side of it. I was young and I thought I was clever, and I thought the way to beat a crooked house was to be a little crookeder, and I lost everything I had and a good deal that wasn't mine. There was a man I'd talked into staking me, a friend of my father's, a decent man, and I lost his money same as my own, and I never made it right with him before he died. That's the long and short of where I learned cards. It's not a thing I'm proud of." He turned his hat in his hands. "I spent a lot of years after that learning the trade honest, learning it inside out, learning every shade and rig a crooked house can run. Not to use them, to know them. So I could sit down at a fixed table and beat it in the open, with no cheating of my own, just by knowing exactly how it was robbing the room. I've done it a few times now in a few towns. I leave the place a little cleaner than I found it and I move on. That's the only thing I've found that takes the taste of that old debt out of my mouth." Della listened to all of it without a flicker. Then she said the thing that I think changed both their lives. She said, "Tom died owing that man across the street $1,100 at his odds and evens game. My husband sat at that bar for 2 years certain he could feel the run of the cards, and the run of the cards killed him as sure as the fever did. So when you say the game's not crooked the way Coombs means, I'd like to know just exactly how it is crooked. Because I've a paper to pay that I don't believe I rightly owe." Gideon Rourke looked at her for a long moment, and I saw the stray dog wariness go out of him, and something steadier come in. "Then I expect I'll be staying past my road money," he said. I have thought a great deal in the years since about why he stayed. It was not the cards. He could have walked into the Spur the next night and beat Royal Tate at odds and evens and walked back out, and the $1,100 would not have come back to Della from it, because beating a man at his own game does not unmake the paper a dead husband signed. No, he stayed for her. He stayed because a tired woman had handed him the last of the pot and called it supper and not charity, and because, for the first time in a long road, there was a thing he wanted to be near. He was just too stove up in his pride to say so for a long while, and so was she. And watching the two of them not say it was the slowest and sweetest thing I ever sat through. But the cards gave them a reason to put their heads together, and that is how it began. Della knew the town's books better than the town did, because she'd been carrying half the town on credit for years, and she had a memory for figures that frightened me. Gideon knew the rig. Between them they made a plan, and it was a long, patient, dangerous plan, and the most dangerous part of it was the patience, because Royal Tate was a patient man too, and he would smell a hurry from across the street. What they needed, Gideon said, was proof. Not a feeling, not a story. Proof a town would believe with its own eyes. They needed to count Tate's deck across enough turns to show, beyond any honest doubt, that it was not the deck he claimed, that the chances were shaded, and then they needed to spring it in front of the whole town at once, so the thing could not be hushed up or laughed off as a sore loser's complaint. So Gideon began to go to the Spur. He went a little at a time, a quiet down-and-out drifter spending the few dollars he'd earned at the Mercer house, the kind of harmless broke man Royal Tate had fleeced 1,000 of. He played small. He lost mostly on purpose, just enough to keep Tate easy and uninterested, and he counted. He had a memory for cards the way Della had for figures, and night after night he counted every turn of the odds and evens deck and carried the count home in his head, and laid it out on Della's kitchen table in long columns of marks, and the two of them bent over it by lamplight while I pretended to scrub pots. And the marks told the tale, slow but plain. Over hundreds of turns, the evens came up just a hair too often, and the run of it matched no honest deck. Gideon could even name the rig. Tate kept the deck shaded toward even, and quietly nudged the game so the house took the even side more often than not, and a man who didn't count across weeks would swear on his mother it was square. It was the most patient theft I ever heard described, and it had built the gilded spur and emptied half of Cedar Crossing, and nobody had ever caught it because there was nothing to catch but a pattern, and you can't show a man a pattern in the heat of a losing night. It was slow work, and it took the better part of the winter, and that winter was the making of everything else, because a winter is a long time to spend at a kitchen table with someone. I watched them fall in love, and I do not think either of them noticed it happening, which is the only honest way it ever happens. It was in the small things. It was the way Gideon started saving the choicest piece of kindling, the straightest splits, for Della's own stove and not the boarders. It was the way she started setting his plate a little fuller than the rest and pretending she hadn't. It was a night he came in late from the Spur with the cold on him, and she had kept a pot of coffee hot for him without a word, and he stood in the door looking at that coffee pot like it was the first warm thing he'd seen in 10 years, and she looked at the floor, and neither of them said one blessed word, and I, 15 and full of opinions, wanted to bang their heads together. He told her, somewhere in there, the rest of his shame, that the friend of his father's he'd ruined had left a widow, and that Gideon had spent years quietly sending her money he'd never let her know the source of, trying to pay back a debt that could not really be paid because the man was dead. He told her he had a fair stake put by now, more than a fair stake, years of honest winnings against crooked houses, but that it didn't sit easy with him, that money, because of where the talent for it came from. And Della listened to all of it, and at the end of it she said, "A man who spends his life giving back more than he took is not the man who did the taking. You've been carrying a dead boy on your back for 20 years. Set him down. I do not know that anyone had ever told Gideon Rourke that he was allowed to set it down. He didn't answer her. But something in him eased after that night, and he started laughing now and again at my fool jokes, and once I caught him whistling while he split wood, and I thought to myself, that woman has worked a cure on him she doesn't even know she's worked. Meanwhile Della was doing her own part, and it was the braver part because she did it in the open. Royal Tate had not forgotten the $1,100. He had been letting it sit, the way a patient man lets a thing ripen, and that spring he came across the street to collect it, or rather to collect what he really wanted, which was the Mercer house itself. He sat down at Della's own table and folded his soft hands and made her an offer in his soft voice. He would forgive the whole debt, he said, every penny of Tom's, if she would sign over the boarding house and the eating room. She'd walk away clean, no debt, a little money in her pocket, free as a bird. Generous, he called it. He even smiled when he said it. I was there. I had a cloth in my hand and I had stopped breathing. Because I knew, the way the boy knew, that the Mercer house was the only honest table in Cedar Crossing, the only door that opened to a busted family, the one place Tate did not own, and that he wanted it the way he wanted everything, so he could close the last door in town that didn't lead to his bar. Della heard him out. She did not raise her voice. She said, "Mr. Tate, my husband owed you that money because you let him believe a fixed game was fair until it killed him. I'll not pretend I don't know that, and I'll not pretend I don't know what you are. I'll pay Tom's paper every dollar because his name's on it and I honor his name. But I'll pay it in coin, not in this house. This house feeds people. Yours empties them. I'd sooner burn it to the ground than hand it to you, and you may tell that to whoever you tell things to." Tate stopped smiling. The soft hands went still on the table. He said very quietly, "The note's due in full at the 1st of June, Mrs. Mercer. In coin, then. $1,100. I'll expect it on the day." And he got up and put on his gray hat and walked back across the street to his bar. And I understood that Della had just done a thing as dangerous as standing in front of a slow train, and that she had done it with her chin up and her voice level. And I have never in my life been prouder to be in a room. $1,100 by the 1st of June. She did not have a tenth of it. The whole plan, the long, patient count of the cards, all of it would mean nothing if she lost the house in June for want of coin. And here is the part that tells you who Gideon Rourke had become. He could have simply paid it. He had the stake. He could have laid $1,100 on the table and saved her the house and never sat down at Tate's bar at all. He offered to, and she would not take it. "I'll not have your money any more than I'd have his charity dressed up as a forgiven debt," she said. "Tom signed that paper at a crooked game. If I let you pay it, the crookedness stands. The game goes on robbing this town tomorrow and the next day and the next, and somebody else's Tom sits down at that bar. I don't want the debt paid, Gideon. I want the game broke. I want the whole town to see it for what it is in the open, so it can never set up here again. If you can do that, if you can show this town the rig and beat it square in front of all of them, then there's no paper to pay, because there's no honest debt and never was. That's the only way I'll have it ended." He looked at her a long time, and then he said the thing I have carried in my chest for 60 years. He said, "I spent 20 years learning to beat crooked tables so I could quiet my own conscience and move on. I never once did it for anybody. Mrs. Mercer, I believe I'd like to do it for you." That was the closest either of them came to saying it out loud, all that winter and spring. It was enough. I saw it land on her like sun. The plan, then, was set for a single night near the end of May before the note came due. It was a market week, when the town was full and the freighters were in and the spur would be packed, the most people under one roof Cedar Crossing ever held. Gideon would sit down at the odds and evens game in front of all of them. He would play it straight, no cheating. That was the iron rule, because the whole point was to beat the rig honest. And he had a way to do it that I did not fully understand until I saw it, and that I will try now to tell you the way it unfolded, because I was there for that too. Della saw to it that I was there. She said a boy ought to see how a crooked thing gets broke, so he'd know it could be. The gilded spur that night was loud and bright and full of smoke, and I stood at the back by the door where Della had told me to stand, and Della herself stood beside me in her good dress with her account book of the town's debts under her arm, because she had a part to play at the end of it. Royal Tate was behind his own bar at the odds and evens layout, soft and smiling, running the deck for a knot of drovers, and the coin was going to the house slow and steady the way it always did. Gideon Rourke came in from the cold like he'd come in a dozen nights that winter, the harmless broke drifter, and he laid down a small coin and called even and lost, and a few men laughed, the same as always. He laid down another and lost again. Tate barely looked at him. Della's stray, losing his Mercer House wages like the saddle tramp everyone knew him to be. And then Gideon began to win. Not wild, not lucky seeming, just steady, the same patient steady the house had used on the town for years, only turned around. He had counted that deck across a whole winter, you see. He knew, better than Tate knew himself, exactly how the rig was shaded, and he played the shade. He bet the even side, the side the rigged deck favored, and he bet it small and constant, and he let the rig itself feed him, because a man who knows precisely how a thing is fixed can ride the fix instead of fighting it. The very crookedness that had bled the town dry began, that night, to bleed Royal Tate, slow and sure and impossible to stop without stopping the game. The pile in front of Gideon grew. Men drifted over to watch. The room got quiet around that end of the bar in a way it never did, and Royal Tate's soft smile got a little fixed at the corners, because he could see his own rig working against him, and he could not understand how this saddle tramp had found the seam. He did what a crooked man does when his rig turns on him. He went to change the deck. That was the moment, and Gideon had waited the whole winter for it. As Tate reached to sweep the deck and bring a fresh one, Gideon put one long hand flat on the cards and said, in that low, even voice that carried clear across the now silent room, "Leave the deck, Mr. Tate. I'd like the whole house to see it counted." The room went dead still. Tate said smooth as ever, "It's my deck, friend, house deck, changed regular." "It is," Gideon agreed. "And I've counted it. Every turn all winter. I can tell this house, card by card, what's in your deck and what isn't, and I'll wager my whole pile against the note you hold on the Mercer House that, when these gentlemen count it out on this bar in front of God and everybody, it won't be the 52 cards you claim. It'll be shaded to even, the way it's been shaded for years, the way it bled every man in this room a little at a time and called it luck." Now there was a sound in the room like a held breath let go, because every man there had lost at that game, slow, year on year, and called himself unlucky, and here was a stranger saying out loud the thing each of them had half suspected and been too ashamed to say. Tate's hand was still on the deck under Gideon's. "And if you're wrong," Tate said softly, "I take your pile and I'll have you run out of this town for slander, drifter and stray." "If I'm wrong," Gideon said, "you take everything I have and I'll go without a word, count it." And then Della stepped forward from the back of the room with her chin up, and she opened her book and she said, in a voice that filled the place, "I'll count it, Mr. Tate. And while these men count cards, I'll read out what this town owes you and how it came to owe it. Let's have all the figures in the open at once. You always said your game was the one honest thing in this house. Let's prove it honest, or let's not. I will not draw it out, because the drawing out is the cruel part, and these were not cruel people. They counted the deck. The whole room crowded round, and a sober-handed freighter laid the cards out face up across the bar one at a time and called each as he laid it, and Della checked them against the count Gideon had carried in his head all winter, and the room watched the numbers come up wrong. The deck was shaded to even, just as Gideon had said. A few cards too many on one side and a few too few on the other. No marks, no rigged box, nothing a man could have caught in a night. Only the long patient theft laid bare at last in a long ribbon of cards on a bar top. There is a particular silence that comes over a roomful of men who have just understood, all at once, that they were robbed for years, and called it their own bad luck. It is not a loud thing. It is worse than loud. Royal Tate stood behind his bar in his gray coat and watched that silence settle on the men he'd been skimming for a decade. And he was a patient man and a smart one, and he understood before any of them moved that Cedar Crossing was not his town anymore and never would be again. He did not bluster. That was not his way. He took his soft hands off the deck and he looked once at Della Mercer with something I can only call hatred, and he said, "The note's worthless then. There's no dead off a fixed game." And by the gray of the next morning he was gone over the ford and west, and the gilded spur stood empty, and Cedar Crossing was free of him. I have heard men tell that night 100 ways since, and most of them put a gun in it somewhere, because folks think a thing can't be settled without one. There was no gun. There was a count of cards on a bar top and a woman reading a book of figures in a clear voice, and that was enough, because the truth in the open is a harder thing to face down than any gun, and Royal Tate knew it better than anyone. Gideon Rourke pushed his whole pile of winnings to the middle of the bar that night, and told the men of Cedar Crossing to divide it among the ones who'd been hardest hit, and they did. And it did not make them whole, because nothing makes a robbed man whole, but it mended what it could. He kept not $1 of it, and the $1,100 Della owed simply ceased to exist, the way a shadow ceases when you bring a lamp, because there had never been an honest debt under it at all. So that is how a plate of stew broke the worst man in the county and gave a town back to itself. But I told you at the start that the kindness came back, and I have not got to the best of it yet, and I would be a poor teller to stop short. Here is what came back. Gideon Rourke did not move on. For the first time on a long road, he stopped. He had a fair stake put by, more than fair. All those years of honest winnings he'd never quite known what to do with because of the shame on them. Della had told him to set the dead boy down, and somewhere that winter he had, and now he had a use for the money that did not taste of the old debt at all. He bought the empty gilded spur from the town for a fair price, and he tore the long bar out of it with his own hands. And where Royal Tate's crooked game had stood, he and Della built rooms, clean, square, warm rooms, and made it the other half of the Mercer house, so that every traveler who came off that cold ford had a decent bed and an honest table and no soft-handed man waiting to bleed him. The first true hotel in Cedar Crossing rose out of the very building that had nearly killed the town, and there is a kind of justice in that I have never gotten over. And the loyalty came back too, which to my mind is worth more than the money. The men of Cedar Crossing did not forget who'd shown them the rig. The drifter the whole town had written off as Della's stray could not walk down the street after that without 3 men wanting to stand him a coffee, and when there was building to do they came with their tools and asked no pay. And when hard winters came the town looked after the Mercer house, the way the Mercer house had quietly looked after the town for years. The kindness Della had been pouring out into her credit book all that time, the meals given and never collected, it all came home at once, the way a long debt the world owes a good person sometimes, just sometimes, gets paid in full. But the thing that came back the most, the thing I was waiting all winter to see, was the plainest of all. They married that fall, Della Mercer and Gideon Rourke, in the new front room of the hotel they'd built out of the wreck of the worst man in the county, with the whole town packed in to see it and me standing up front in a clean shirt Della had made me. There was no grand to-do. He took her hand and he said, where everyone could hear, "You gave me the last of the pot and called it supper and not charity, and I've understood every day since that you handed me my whole life across that table and didn't know you were doing it. I mean to spend what's left of mine making sure you never give away your last of anything again." And Della, who had stood up to Royal Tate without a tremor, could not get a single word out, and only held onto his hand and nodded, and the whole room had to look at the floor a minute to give them their privacy in plain sight. They had a long life of it. I worked for them until I was a grown man, and then they staked me to my own place, the way the dead friend's stake should have gone right all those years before, and Gideon stood over me and made sure I never sat down at a crooked table in my life. There were children in the Mercer house after a while, and the eating room stayed the best table between the river and the mountains, and the credit book went right on being written in and never collected on, because some habits a good woman doesn't break and a wise man doesn't ask her to. Gideon Rourke never gambled again, not once, not for a penny. He said he'd done the only honest thing a man could do with that talent, the night he broke the spur, and after that he'd no further use for it. He died an old man in his own bed in a town that loved him, with Della holding his hand, and the town turned out for him the way it had not turned out for any man before or since, because they had not forgotten the drifter who'd given them back their own pockets and asked for nothing. So when they sit me down on the porch now and ask me what saved this town, I tell them the truth, and I'll tell you the same. It was not the count of the cards, though that was clever. It was not the night the rig got broke, though that was brave. It was a tired woman with a debt she didn't owe and not much left in her own pot, looking at a hungry stranger the whole world had written off and deciding he was worth the last plate of stew. Everything else came out of that one small decent thing, the way a whole spring comes out of a single thaw. I have lived a long time and seen a great deal, and that is the truest thing I know. The world keeps a ledger longer than any of us think, and a kindness given freely to a man who can't pay it back has a way of going out into the dark and coming home, in its own time by its own road, bringing more with it than you ever sent out. Della Mercer never gave that stew expecting a thing. That is exactly why it came back so heavy. And if you want to know what Cedar Crossing was before it was this fine painted town, I'll tell you once more, and you can laugh if you like. It was very nearly lost. And it was saved by a plate of stew.